Maya Gavanan Melanin Amenex Wilaid. I am David of Many Colours and welcome to part 4 in our series comparing the second half of Peter Jackson's Fellowship movie to book 2 of Professor Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. In the last video I talked all about the Fellowship's journey through Moria, and so in this video I will talk about their time in Lothlórien. But before I get to that, I want to start by talking all about a character in the movies who was completely made up by Peter Jackson. He has no book counterpart. And this guy, I think, is my favourite movie-only character, Lurtz. So, Book 2 of The Lord of the Rings is kind of unique of the 6 in that it is the only one that doesn't really have a villain to fight at the end of it. Obviously, in Book 1, there are the Nazgûl at the fords of Bruinen, and in Book 3, there is Saruman at Orthanc, in Book 4, there is Shelob, in Book 5, there is the Mordor army at the Black Gate, and in Book 6, there is Saruman again, this time in the Shire. But the main antagonist at the end of Book 2 is kind of Boromir. Now, I think referring to Boromir as a villain is far too ungracious, and I would certainly defend him from such accusations, but I think Peter Jackson made a really good choice here in wanting to invent his own villain for the movie, someone that could give a face to Boromir's killer and also provide a foe for Aragorn to vanquish. So I do really like Lurtz, or as I've heard him referred to on the internet, the Ariana Grande orc, which seems a little bit harsh to Ariana Grande, although, to be fair, their hairstyles are not similar. Anyway, in talking about Lurtz, I also have to talk about Saruman, because although Saruman is obviously a really important part of this movie, in this book, he doesn't actually appear at all. In fact, Saruman does not physically appear on the page until this scene in Book 3, which interestingly means Saruman's first appearance in the books is his final appearance in the movies. And so, movie Saruman and book Saruman are very different characters. I'll talk about it more when we get to The Two Towers, but in both that movie and The Fellowship, we are kind of led to believe that Saruman identifies as a servant of Sauron. I think in the second movie, we're explicitly told he is a puppet of Sauron's, but that is not who Saruman is in the book, not at all. Saruman is very much his own agent. He is completely ideologically independent from either the Free Peoples or the servants of the enemy. Now, obviously, he claims allegiance to Sauron, but he also claims to be a friend of Theoden. Saruman lies, and the truth is that after revealing his treachery to Gandalf, Saruman is exclusively working for himself. I think if everything had gone his way, then obviously his Uruk-hai would have brought him the ring, and at that point he would have revealed that he is no puppet of Sauron's. I think he would have tried to use the ring to overthrow Sauron, which I don't think he would have been successful in doing, but he would have tried to, and then he would have tried to establish himself as this new master of the ring, a new Dark Lord who rules Middle-earth through industry and technology and his own brand of progress. Anyway, before moving back to the Fellowship, there is one more big detail that I want to talk about, but I must have read the books like half a dozen times before I really picked up on it. So, as I said, Lurtz is made up for the movies, but in the Two Towers book, we do learn that the leader of Saruman's Uruk-hai is a guy called Ugluk, who totally does make it into the movies. But in the movies, they just sort of bump into a few of the orcs of Mordor, led by a guy called Grishnach. And they don't really get along, but there's not much of an explanation of what's really going on with these two orc factions, or how they found each other, or what they're even doing in that part of the world. But in the books, if we really read between the lines, we find that there's actually a really complex web of 3 independent orc groups all chasing the Fellowship before they all unite at Amon Hen to kill Boromir and capture Merry and Pippin. So, although I don't want to get too ahead of myself with this right now, I will say that the first of these 3 orc groups come from neither Mordor nor Isengard. They are in fact mountain orcs of Moria. Remember in the last video when I said that Aragorn beheaded the huge orc chieftain that stabbed Frodo in the Chamber of Mazabul? Well, as is implied by the word chieftain, this great orc had followers, and after the Fellowship leave Moria, a group of these followers follow them, seeking revenge for their fallen chief. So, in the book, Saruman's Uruk-hai are not the only ones pursuing the Fellowship. And I'll get back to these Moria orcs in just a few minutes, but there is also one other orc group that I'll very briefly mention now, and then expand on a lot more when they become relevant, and they are the orcs of Mordor, led by this guy, Grishnach, who also shows up in the movie, but his character is a lot more memorable in the books. So we don't really know very much about Grishnach prior to his appearance in the Two Towers, but we do know that he was sent by Sauron with the express purpose of searching for the ring and bringing the Baggins who bears it back to Barad-dûr, or Lugburts, which is what the Dark Tower is called by the orcs of Mordor. And so, while the Fellowship are leaving Moria and coming to Lothlórien, somewhere not too far away, Grishnach is travelling north with a band of orcs, and also with a winged Nazgul, which is a great little subplot that I'll talk all about in the next video. Anyway, it's actually a little bit unclear whether Grishnach and his Mordor orcs meet up with Ugluk and his Isengarders before or after Boromir's death. When Aragorn looks at the dead orcs, he says, "Here lie many that are not folk of Mordor," which I guess could mean either there are some dead orcs of Mordor and many from elsewhere, which would mean that Grishnach's orcs were there at Amon Hen, but not many of them died, or perhaps it's a roundabout way of saying that there were no orcs from Mordor present. But either way, we know for a fact that of the orcs who kill Boromir and capture Merry and Pippin, some are Isengarders under the command of Ugluk, or Lurtz in the movies, but there are others who are orcs of Moria. And these guys don't know anything about the ring or a halfling called Baggins. All they want is revenge on Aragorn and his companions for killing their chief. And the story of these mountain orcs begins just after the Fellowship leave Moria and find themselves in the valley of Azanulbizar, or Nanduhirion, as it is known in Elvish, or the Dimril Dale, as it is translated out of Westron. And so, with these Moria orcs in your mind, I will now jump back to our Company of the Ring, and I'll talk a little bit about what they get up to immediately after losing Gandalf. So obviously in the movies, they sit down and they mourn for a little bit, and then Aragorn tells them that they must hurry, and within a few seconds, they're heading into the woods of Lothlórien. And this is broadly what happens in the books, but there's a lot more going on, and we take a lot more time to explore this part of Middle-earth. Now, I won't go into too much detail here, but upon leaving Moria, the Fellowship finds itself in the Valley of Azanulbizar, which is a very significant place in Dwarven culture. Obviously, this is where the Battle of Azanulbizar was fought, which we get a little glimpse of in the Hobbit movies, but the main reason this place matters to the dwarves goes back way, way, way further than that. So, as I've talked about in this video, the first dwarf ever to awaken in Middle-earth was called Durin the Deathless, and he is the ancestor of all the long-beard dwarves, which is all dwarves in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, except, interestingly, Bombur. Anyway, it was here at Azanulbizar that Durin the Deathless first looked into the lake Kheled Zaram, and he had the vision that inspired him to found Khazad-dûm. And the spot where Durin the Deathless had this vision is marked with a great pillar called the Durin Stone. So, Gimli, who is apparently very clued in on his dwarvish history, takes Frodo and Sam to see the stone, and they all gaze into the waters, and they see stars above them, even though it's still daylight. Anyway, the Fellowship soon move on from Dwarvish history to Elven history, as they journey south away from the Misty Mountains and into the woods of Lothlórien, where Legolas tells us all about the story of Amroth, that's Lothlórien's last king, and his lover Nimrodel, a Sylvan elf of the Golden Wood. And this is a very cool story, but it is quite a long story, and if I go into it now, then we're going to get very bogged down in stuff that's not particularly relevant to either the Lord of the Rings books or the movies, so I'll potentially save that for another video. Anyway, while the Fellowship are walking through the woods, Aragorn finally remembers that Frodo was straight up stabbed not too long ago, and Sam also took a nasty head injury during the fight in the Chamber of Marzabul, so they finally stop. And Aragorn shows off his skills as a healer again, by using dried athelas to heal the cut on Sam's head. And when the company gets going again, Frodo hears the sound of something following them, which he initially assumes to be orcs, but he's wrong. Sting is not glowing blue, and the only glimpse he can catch are two pale eyes. Anyway, I guess the main difference between this part of the books and the movies is that in the movies, the Fellowship are found by Haldir pretty quickly and then taken to Galadriel and Celeborn straight away. But in the books, Lothlorien is not a small wood, and the Fellowship walk for ages before getting anywhere near to Caras Galadhon. That's the woodland city / fortress where Galadriel and Celeborn rule. In fact, it takes almost 3 days of walking for the Fellowship to get from here to here. But that's not to say that it takes 3 days before the Fellowship meet any Wood Elves. On their second night in the Golden Wood, Legolas suggests that they sleep safely in the branches of the trees, which is a very easy thing for a Wood Elf to say, but sleeping in trees is very much not something that dwarves or even hobbits are comfortable with. Remember, hobbits don't even believe in going upstairs to go to bed, let alone climbing a tree. Anyway, this is where we first meet that fan favourite character, Haldir, as well as 2 of his lesser-known brothers, Rúmil and Orofin. But, unlike in the movie, before we see the elves in the book, we first hear their voices. And with the exception of Haldir, most of these wood elves don't actually speak Westron, or the common tongue, which is an interesting reminder that the elves of Lothlórien are super isolationist and very rarely ever interact with outsiders. Anyway, luckily, Haldir does speak Westron, and Legolas, being a wood elf of Mirkwood, does speak a Sylvan language that's similar enough to the language of Lothlórien. And when Sam asks Legolas what these wood elves are saying, Legolas delivers that iconic line that Haldir gets in the movies. "They say you breathe so loud that they could shoot you in the dark." To which Sam hastily puts a hand over his mouth. Anyway, the Wood Elves, who call themselves the Galadhrim, are relatively friendly with the Fellowship, but they're not particularly kind to Gimli. In fact, one could argue they're straight up racist to Gimli. At first, Haldir refuses to let him pass at all, simply because he's a dwarf. But after a little bit of vouching from Aragorn and Legolas, they do agree to let him pass, but only on the condition that he is blindfolded. And this leads to a whole load of bickering between Legolas and Gimli, and to be fair to them both, I can kind of see where they're coming from. On the one hand, Gimli really doesn't like the idea of being treated like a beggar or a prisoner or a spy, and so Aragorn suggests that they all go blindfolded to make it nice and fair. But then Legolas, he resents that he's not allowed to witness the beauty of the wood, despite being a kinsman here. In the end, as it goes, they are all blindfolded, but both Legolas and Gimli remain rather salty about it. Anyway, during the night, Frodo lies awake, and he hears the sound of far-off fighting, which is where we return to those Moria orcs that I talked about a few minutes ago. We are told that a strong company of orcs has entered the Golden Wood. And although Haldir says none of the orcs will ever return out of Lórien, we know this isn't actually true. Many are no doubt picked off by Haldir's hunters, but we will see this orc warband again more than once in the next video. So at least some do survive. Anyway, in addition to the orcs, the Galadhrim also notice a strange orc-like creature, but also not orc-like. They say it reminds them of a hobbit, and so they decide not to shoot it. Which is of course a very good thing, because if the Galadhrim had shot this slinking creature, just think how different things would go later in the story. And just before I move on to Galadriel and Celeborn, I want to take a brief moment to talk about that word Galadhrim, because you can certainly be forgiven for thinking, in fact I assumed this for a long time, that Galadhrim just means the Elves of Galadriel. She is the lady of the Galadhrim, she lives in Caras Galadhon, but this is not actually the case. These two words, Galad and Galath, have totally different etymologies and they mean completely different things. So the Galad in Galadriel means something along the lines of bright radiance. And so Galadriel's name means maiden crowned with a garland of bright radiance. That is the exact wording that Christopher Tolkien used in The Peoples of Middle-earth. But Galath, on the other hand, that just means tree, or specifically a thick, dense and branching tree. And so the words Galadhrim and Caras Galadhon have nothing to do with Galadriel. It's just a cool little coincidence that they sound so similar. Anyway, the Fellowship's meeting with Galadriel and Celeborn is pretty faithfully adapted in the movie, and I think Cate Blanchett does a fantastic job with the character of Galadriel. In fact, I'd probably say that hers is the best portrayal of any of the elves in the movie. Although, I will point out that this scene is not framed as particularly sinister in the books, but in the movies I get a very weird vibe from Galadriel and Celeborn when we first meet them. And it's a very different vibe from the friendly vibes we get when she's giving her gifts a few scenes later, although that is also quite different from when she looks into the mirror. Galadriel is a woman of many different vibes in the movie. Anyway, just like in the movie, after a little bit of mind probing, the Fellowship are given refuge in Caras Galadhon, where they sleep off their weariness and their sorrow. And they spend quite a long time in Lothlórien, although there is a very interesting detail here, as no one in the Fellowship is really able to reckon exactly how long it's been. It seems that time passes more slowly in Lothlórien, and although it feels to the Fellowship like they've only been there a few days, when they leave, Sam notices that the phases of the moon are all wrong, and we learn that it's actually been almost a whole month since they arrived in Galadriel's realm. And I reckon this is an effect of her elven ring, Nenya, which has the power to preserve and slow the ravages of time. Anyway, the Fellowship don't really do a huge amount during their month in Caras Galadhon, aside from resting, mourning Gandalf, and planning the next stage of their journey. Although we are told that during their stay, Legolas was away much among the Galadhrim, and after the first night he did not sleep with the other companions. Although there is something really sweet here, as we're also told that often he took Gimli with him, and the others wondered at this change. So I think this time in Lothlórien really is the genesis of that profound friendship that we all know and love between Legolas and Gimli. I think Legolas's disdain for the dwarves probably began to thaw when he saw the tragedy in Moria, and Gimli's disdain for the elves began to disappear when he beheld the loveliness of the Lady Galadriel. But anyway, the two main things that happen in Lothlórien, in both the books and the movies, are the Mirror of Galadriel and the gifts from Lórien. And I'll talk about both of these in a minute, but first, I want to quickly jump back to Gandalf. Because, obviously, from the perspective of all the other characters, and also the readers, and also the viewers, if it's the movies, Gandalf is, for all intents and purposes, dead. But if we take a look at the chronology, we will learn that 6 days after the Fellowship arrive in Caras Galadhon, Gandalf has his epic battle with the Balrog atop the peak of Ziraxigil. And he and the Balrog fight on this mountaintop for 2 whole days, seemingly non-stop. As we all know, Gandalf eventually kills his foe, but he dies in the process, and we're told that his body lay where he died for 20 days before he was returned to life. And as it goes, the day that Gandalf returned to life is the exact same day that Frodo looks into the Mirror of Galadriel. So, at roughly the same time this scene is happening, Gandalf is waking up on Ziraxigil as Gandalf the White. And I will come back to this at the end of the video. But of all the scenes in Lothlórien, it is probably the Mirror of Galadriel scene that is the most different in the movies compared to the books. I mean, to be fair, pretty much everything that happens in the movie does also happen in the books, but there's a lot more in the books that doesn't make it into the film. And one of the key differences here is that in the book, Frodo does not go alone with Galadriel. Sam joins them. In fact, Sam is actually the one who looks into the mirror first. And what Sam sees are a few chilling visions of the future. He sees Frodo apparently lying dead beneath a dark cliff. He sees his old enemy, Ted Sandyman, that's the Miller of Hobbiton, cutting down trees and polluting the Shire with industry, which of course comes true at the end of the story with the scouring of the Shire, in which Ted Sandyman is a particularly nasty collaborator. And Sam is actually tempted by his vision to give up on the quest and to go back home to deal with it, but he doesn't. After a few words of encouragement from Galadriel, Sam decides that he'll go home by the long road with Mr. Frodo, or not at all. And then it is Frodo's turn to look into the mirror. But Frodo's visions are a little bit more cryptic. The first thing he sees is an old man with a white staff who reminds him of Gandalf. Now, in the moment, Frodo wonders if this is actually Saruman, but considering that Gandalf has just returned to life on this very same day, I would speculate that this really could be Gandalf that Frodo is seeing. But then Frodo beholds a fairly rapid stream of images, including Bilbo, a tall ship sailing west, a river flowing through a city, a white fortress with 7 towers, black ships with black sails, and a banner bearing the symbol of a white tree. But then the vision changes again, and Frodo sees an eye rimmed with fire. And just like in the movie, the one ring grows heavy around his neck, and it starts dragging him down towards the mirror. And just like in the movie, after this, Frodo offers the ring to Galadriel. But in the movie, Galadriel has a pretty extreme reaction to this. And this isn't necessarily a change from the books, as the words she says are pretty much taken verbatim, but it's really up to the reader how we imagine them being delivered. Obviously, in the movies, this is a pretty stressful moment, but in the books, we're told that Galadriel laughed with a sudden, clear laugh before going off on her whole, or you will have a queen stronger than the foundations of the earth thing. And so, just for the sake of contrast, I'll play this scene from the 1978 animated film by Ralph Bakshi, which in this scene is very different from Peter Jackson's film, although it is hard to say which is more faithful to Tolkien's writings, as I guess we the fans have to decide that for ourselves. Anyway, the last big thing that happens in Lothlórien takes place the day after Frodo and Sam look into the mirror. And this is of course the scene where the Fellowship receive their gifts before being sent off in their boats. And right here is where we see a few more really big changes between the books and the films. So in the movies, Frodo, Legolas and Gimli get the exact same gifts that they get in the book. The Phial of Galadriel, a bow of the Galadhrim, and 3 hairs from Galadriel's head respectively. Now, Gimli's gift is very significant for a whole host of quite complicated reasons pertaining to the Silmarillion and Galadriel's uncle Feanor and how her hair inspired the light of his Silmarils, but when Feanor asked her for a strand of her hair, she refused him because he was such a jerk, but then she ends up giving 3 strands to Gimli because he's not a jerk, and the whole thing is a really great callback to that, which I've talked about in other videos, and most of you probably already know. Although, I will say that Galadriel's first appearance in Tolkien's writings is this. It's The Lord of the Rings, and then later in his life, Tolkien retroactively added her into the Silmarillion. So when people say this is a reference to the Silmarillion, it's probably more accurate to say that the whole Feanor hair thing in the Silmarillion is a callback to this. Anyway, the other gifts from Lórien are quite a bit different in the books than they are in the films. So I'll start with Aragorn, because in the movie he gets no gifts. Well, actually he does, he gets a dagger from Celeborn, doesn't he? But Galadriel says that she has no gift greater than the one he already bears. But this Elfstone of Arwen's doesn't actually feature in the books. Instead, the Elfstone, or the Elasar, for which Aragorn later takes his kingly name, is a gift from Galadriel. And although I do think it was a good decision for the filmmakers to have Arwen be the one who gives Aragorn this jewel, it is a big deal in Tolkien's writings that Galadriel is the one who gives it to him. Remember, Galadriel is Arwen's grandmother. So instead of the Elfstone being a symbol of Arwen's love for Aragorn, in the books, it is a symbol of Arwen's family, given by the matriarch of her family, and it is announcing that Aragorn is welcome among them. It's a sort of wedding gift from the bride's family to the groom. And there are quite a few different origin stories for this Elfstone that connect it to Celebrimbor, that's the grandson of Feanor, the dude who forged the Elven Rings, as well as potentially Gandalf, the Valier Yavanna, she's kind of like the goddess of growing things, and it was also originally given by Galadriel to her own daughter, Celebrian, who is of course the mother of Arwen. So this stone is a big deal. And it's not even Aragorn's only gift. He's also given a scabbard for his sword, Andúril, which implies he didn't have one up until now, which I find a bit strange, but I don't know, maybe he did and it just wasn't as good as the one Galadriel and Celeborn give him. Either way, this new scabbard is really special. We are told that the blade that is drawn from this sheath shall not be stained or broken, even in defeat. So keep that in your mind, because I feel like some members of the Fellowship get much better gifts than others. For example, whilst Aragorn is getting his Elfstone and his special scabbard, Boromir gets a belt. Just a belt, that's it. Admittedly, it is a golden belt, but it's not like a magical belt or anything. It doesn't really feature again in the story, except as a way for Frodo to prove to Faramir that he did know Boromir. And Merry and Pippin's gifts also aren't really all that amazing. They get silver belts, although it is interesting that the hobbits get silver belts and Boromir gets a golden one. Elves love silver, and they associate with it much more than they do with gold. Gold is the shiny metal for men. And so, perhaps the silver belts for Merry and Pippin are a way of welcoming them into elven culture, and perhaps Boromir's golden belt is an example of cultural appreciation on behalf of the elves. Anyway, my favourite gift is Galadriel's gift to Sam, which is very different from the gift of rope that he gets in the films, although actually the Fellowship do also get elven ropes along with cloaks and lembas in the books, but Sam's specific gift is a garden box containing soil from Lothlórien's orchards and a single silver seed that Sam will one day plant in the Shire and watch grow into the only Malorn tree between the mountains and the sea. And the reason I like this gift so much is that it's completely useless to the quest at hand. You know, unlike Legolas's bow or Frodo's file, a box of dirt cannot be used until after the ring is destroyed. And so not only is the garden box a lovely practical gift for a gardener, it's also a symbol of hope. Galadriel would not have given it if she didn't truly believe that the quest would eventually be successful. And it's also a way of preserving Lothlórien's beauty in another part of Middle-earth after Galadriel's realm fades. But just before I finish this video, I want to leave you with something really interesting, because as I mentioned not long ago, the Fellowship spend a whole month in Lothlórien and they don't leave until the 16th of February. But what's absolutely nuts is that on the 17th of February, Gwaihir the Eagle arrives in Lothlórien, carrying the newly resurrected Gandalf. And it's in Lothlórien that Gandalf is replenished and given a new staff by Galadriel and white robes to wear. But as I end this video, I invite you to go down the rabbit hole of what would have happened if the Fellowship had left just one day later. Would they have tarried longer in Lothlórien? Would Gandalf have journeyed down the river with them? Would Gollum have lingered too long and been shot by the Galadhrim? Would the Fellowship have broken when it did? Would Boromir have died when he did? Would Merry and Pippin have been captured by Uruk-hai? Would they have encountered the Ents? Would Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli have ever gone to Rohan? The more I think about it, the more the entire story unravels if the Fellowship left Lothlórien just one day later. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd love it if you'd share the channel with friends and fellow Tolkien fans. And of course, don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a like and a comment if you want to. But until next time, my dear friends, as always, much love. Stay groovy and Navaya Melanin.